Welcome to this week's edition of The Legal Journal. Now, here's your host, Ross Brindle.
Well, good Saturday morning. Once again, you are listening to The Legal Journal on Business 1570. I'm Ross Brindle. I would be your astute host yet again for this Saturday morning. And I'm joined in studio this morning by Susan Kohler. She is with Halunen and Associates. I believe I got that right. How are you, Susan?
I think you did. I am just great. Thank you very much, Ross.
Well, it's very good to see you. Before we go into the topic at hand, I want you to tell me a little bit about yourself and basically the associates that you work with and maybe just a little bit of your background.
Sure. I work at a law firm called Halunen and Associates. I'm a senior attorney there. Our offices are in downtown Minneapolis in the IDS Center. We represent plaintiffs. We represent people who've had bad things happen to them. We represent whistleblowers, employees, and consumers who've been treated badly, cheated, lost their jobs, or otherwise have had difficult things happen to them and need legal advice. I primarily do whistleblower qui tam cases and consumer cases, and it's a practice that's very exciting, and I really enjoy it. I've been doing qui tam cases for several years now, and I'm very proud of the fact that my firm and myself represented one of the relators in the third largest qui tam case ever settled over the history of the qui tam lawsuit. It's a recent case that was announced involving Abbott Laboratories, and that settlement was for $1.5 billion. So that's a very major case, and it was really an honor to be a part of it. So that's a little bit of my background. My law firm does do qui tam cases. We have several in the works. We've represented other people in qui tam cases, and we like to think that we know what we're doing and do a good job.
What is the best way? I'll ask this right away. What's the best way if somebody's listening today and they want to reach out to you in the firm? What's the best way for them to do that? Is there a website? Is there a phone number you want them to call? What's the best way to get more information?
Sure. We have a website at www.halunenlaw.com. That's HALUNENLAW.com. That has the phone number where you can reach us if somebody's interested in getting information about qui tam cases. If they think that they may be in a position to need legal assistance, they can call the number on the website.
HALUNEN law.com. That's correct? Right. Well, my first question then basically dovetails off of your background. You mentioned the word or words qui tam. Why don't you just tell us briefly, what is qui tam? What is a qui tam lawsuit?
Okay. To understand a qui tam lawsuit, it's important to understand the concept of what is a whistleblower.
Okay.
People have probably heard that word before. A whistleblower is generally a person who reports some sort of illegal activity by some other person. The most common situation where you see whistleblowers are employees who work at companies, and many states, including Minnesota, have whistleblower laws that allow them to report illegal activity on the part of their company to the company or to a government agency or some sort of investigative body, and those employees are protected by whistleblower laws from retaliation. So that's what a whistleblower is. A whistleblower reports illegal activity. A qui tam lawsuit involves a special kind of whistleblower, and this is a whistleblower who knows about fraud against the government and reports that fraud.
So the term qui tam, maybe that's important to back up a tad bit too. Where does the term qui tam come from as well?
The term qui tam actually is rooted in English common law. There are a lot of different kinds of qui tam cases, although it's come to be connected to these cases involving fraud against the government. It's from a Latin phrase that I won't read to you, but the phrase means he who sues on behalf of the king as well as for himself. It comes from an old British concept of really delegating individual citizens to bring lawsuits on behalf of the government, and that benefits the government. It also can benefit the person bringing the lawsuit.
And in that definition, it basically, in a very brief sense, describes what type of lawsuit a qui tam lawsuit is.
Correct. It's a lawsuit brought on behalf of the government. And that's why the person bringing the lawsuit is not called a plaintiff, which is the normal term for the person who does that. They're called a relator. So the caption in a lawsuit is John Jones, or it's the United States of America through John Jones, the relator, against the company.
So I don't want to say middleman, but so to speak, they're kind of the one that, well, as you mentioned, they're the whistleblower. They bring the problem forward, and then essentially you have maybe the government and the relator working together. Is
Correct.
that correct?
Well, it's interesting in these days of...
That might not have been the best way to frame that question, but I think you understood what I was trying to say.
Sure. And I think this is a really interesting point in these days where everybody is talking about the size of government and is big government good, is small government good. This statute actually originated during the Civil War, when people were selling bad mules and horses to the government to fight the war, and obviously that was difficult. And so the legislature at the time passed this statute. And the idea is that the government does not have the resources to enforce and to monitor all of its dealings.
Sure.
And so it enlists the help of private citizens to uncover fraud against the government. And that statute was passed 150 years ago, and it's still very, very operative today. I belong to a professional group of people who do this kind of work all the time, and we talk about the qui tam lawsuit as incentivizing integrity. It's a way to give people motivation to act on their integrity. If they see something wrong going on, if they see the government being cheated, to act on it, and then the qui tam statute provides them a reward, basically, or a remedy for being brave and making those claims against a company.
You're listening to the Legal Journal on Business 1570. I'm your host, Ross Brindle, joined in studio this morning by Susan Kohler. She is with Halunen and Associates. You can learn more at halunenlaw.com. I'll spell that. HALUNEN law.com. That's halunenlaw.com. Susan, if you don't mind, I keep feeling like I'm backtracking with you, but each answer you give me gives me just another question that pops into my head. Important to note as well, if you don't mind, just your background yet again, and maybe how did you get into working with qui tam lawsuits?
Well, I represent employees who have had problems with their employers, and so whistleblowers fall into that category of people. And so often the people who have knowledge about fraud going on within some company, fraud against the government, are employees. And regrettably, qui tam cases are stories of great courage as well, because often the employees who report to their company that something bad is going on, often they get fired or bad things happen to them. They get put into a cubicle, they get shunned. Even though there are legal protections for whistleblower, that doesn't mean that the companies always act on those legal protections. So representing employees, we see employees who have claims against the government, and that's actually how I got into it. I had a client come in who said something bad is going on is at my company, and I'd like to do something about that, and that's how I got into the qui tam business.
If you have a question or comment, you can call in 651-289-4477. That's 651-289-4477. You can text as well, which I know is very helpful to a lot of our listeners, 651-243-0391. That's 651-243-0391. Don't forget, you can always listen online as well at business1570.com. Susan, so many things I want to talk about, but I know we had talked briefly when I was preparing for the show, or I was looking at stuff to ask you. False Claims Act. What is the False Claims Act? Can we talk about that briefly?
Sure. As I said, the False Claims Act was actually passed during the American Civil War as a way to protect the government from people who were trying to cheat the government by selling them bad stuff.
And it's still working today. We're still using that, correct?
It is still incredibly working today. This year, False Claims Act cases are likely to bring about $9 billion back to the government.
Wow.
And probably about 80% of those cases were actually brought by whistleblowers who brought qui tam cases against the government. So it's very effective. And as a matter of fact, the statute itself has been revised because I think the government is realizing that it's a very powerful way to root out fraud. As I said, the government can't police every contract it has with every vendor.
Sure.
Somebody selling paper clips.
Can you imagine trying to do that?
Right.
That's why this is important, correct?
Right. It's incredibly important because it's a way for the government to capitalize on the citizen who has integrity and who cares about things.
Here is a text question that came in, and I know you probably can't speak specifically on it, but you might be able to talk in generalities. The Denny Hecker case in Minnesota was huge. Was that a qui tam case, or was that completely different? Do you happen to know off the top of your head and exactly maybe how that came together?
That was not brought as a qui tam case
Okay.
against the government. So the qui tam cases against the government, there has to be actual fraud against the government. In that case, there probably was fraud against the government, but it was uncovered through a criminal investigation. So sometimes fraud gets uncovered in a variety of ways.
What makes a qui tam lawsuit different from other kinds of whistleblower cases? Because there have been a lot of highly publicized whistleblower cases in the past. What makes them different? I don't want to say what sets them apart, but what are the differences?
Well, the main difference is that the person who brings the lawsuit doesn't have to be a direct victim of illegal activity.
They can just see it. They can witness it.
They can witness it. Let me give you an example of a person who brought a qui tam lawsuit. There was a woman whose name was Tina Gonter, and she was a metals inspector, and she worked in a Navy or she worked for a company that made valves for the Navy, and she realized that these valves were defective. She began to worry about the impact of these defective valves on people who were serving the country. She complained to her company. They started shunning her. They refused to follow her recommendations with regard to these faulty valves. Eventually, she got legal counsel. And she actually worked on her qui tam case while she was still employed by this company. She actually wore a wire for 6 months while they collected activity. So at some point, a qui tam case is different because it involves a partnership with the government if the government is interested in pursuing the case. And in this case, they were able to actively investigate it while she was working there. Now, eventually, she did get fired. And this is where the courage, obviously she had a lot of courage to start off with.
Sure.
But she was unemployed for a very long period of time after that because obviously others in the industry would blacklist her because she was known, as a whistleblower. Eventually, the case did come to fruition and the company was penalized for that bad conduct. But that's the kind of situation that can bring about a qui tam lawsuit. It's somebody who's not victimized themselves, but sees something very bad happening and does something about it. One piece I wanted to be sure to tell your listeners is that qui tam lawsuits are not just tip lines. You really do need to know something about what's going on.
Sure.
But on the other hand, qui tam lawsuits are brought by people other than employers as well. Sometimes qui tam lawsuits are brought by businesses. Sometimes they see other businesses cheating the government and then getting a competitive edge in the marketplace. And that impacts a business's bottom line.
Sure.
And so there's a long-standing qui tam case by a pharmaceutical company who realized that other pharmaceutical companies were cheating the government and getting an advantage over them, and they brought a qui tam lawsuit.
Well, I like what you told me off the air, Susan, and you kind of alluded to it at the very beginning of the show. Again, we're joined by Susan Kohler. She is with Halunen and Associates. You can learn more at halunenlaw.com, HALUNEN law.com. What you said at the beginning of the show and what we talked about off air is, this is an issue where it doesn't really matter where you're even at politically or if you believe in bigger government or small government. This is kind of something where if you look at it, everybody can pretty much agree, whether you think government should be big or small. If the government's being cheated, everybody's losing.
That's correct. Taxpayers are losing, and other people are victimized as well. The largest area where this fraud occurs is in the healthcare area. So you can imagine if drugs are being prescribed for people that haven't been indicated for a particular diagnosis, they could be harmed by that.
Wow.
The military, if they're getting bulletproof vests, which was one qui tam case that was brought, that are defective, that incredibly puts them in harm's way. And so the notion of incentivizing integrity is very important in this, and it does impact the taxpayers because the bottom line is that money that is cheated, when people cheat the government out of money, they're cheating taxpayers out of money.
Well, let's stay with the False Claims Act, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Does the False Claims Act, does it actually work to uncover fraud? Is that the goal of it? Is that just part of it? Or am I mistaking there?
That is the goal of it, and it does actually work. I mentioned to you that this year our professional group is anticipating that $9 billion is going to be collected on behalf of the government. Since about 1986, when the False Claims Act was sort of revitalized, over $31 billion has been brought back to the government.
Wow.
Which actually leads to something we haven't talked about, and that's what the reward is. You haven't asked me that question yet, but let's talk about it.
You just asked it, so I'll let you answer it. You know this radio thing pretty well, how it works. You're becoming a host already.
Well, I don't think so, but I'm very interested in this topic, and I love talking about it, so it's not hard to.
Let's talk about that then.
All right. The reward is that the whistleblower who brings the qui tam lawsuit gets a percentage of what the government recovers as a result of the lawsuit. If the government gets involved in the lawsuit, the qui tam relator typically gets 10 to 15% of what the government recovers. Sometimes you can proceed with a qui tam lawsuit even if the government chooses not to become a part of it. If you do that, and if you're successful, the qui tam relator gets between 25 and 30% of what the government recovers. So it can be a very significant reward. I told you that I was involved in a case that settled for $1.5 billion recently. Now, some of that was a criminal penalty. $800 million of that was the civil penalty. There were several relators in that case, so there were more than one. But the relator's share in that case was $82 million. So
was that more of a class action suit, so to speak?
No.
Okay.
It was an individual qui tam lawsuit. Sometimes more than one person will file a lawsuit against a company. And sometimes that's problematic, and we'll talk about that later. But in terms of the reward can be very great. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is that we always hear about the huge, huge, huge rewards that are in the multi-million-dollar range. Qui tam lawsuits typically need to have a certain size to make it worthwhile for the government to investigate them. But qui tam lawsuits can result in settlements or resolutions in the $200,000 to $500,000 range, as well as in the $1 million range. You tend to see a lot in the $4 or $5 million range. And so, obviously, those rewards are great. And some people think, well, the qui tam relators, they just want to get the money. Let me tell you, it is not an easy thing to be a qui tam relator. You have to have a lot of courage. Sometimes you get blacklisted in the industry. One interesting piece about these claims is that they're filed under seal. So you can't talk about it for many, many years sometimes because they take a lot of time. And you don't know when you start it where it's going to end up. You could end up ruining your career, ruining your ability to get a job in the industry, and you could end up with nothing. Or sometimes people do end up with very satisfying rewards. But the whole notion is that the government wants to make it really worth people's while to report fraud against the government.
Well, and I would say that I would venture to guess that it's probably fair to say a lot of people, when they maybe bring something like this to you, maybe they went to the website at halunenlaw.com, and maybe they reached out to you, they might not even know that there's anything in it for them. They might just be saying, look, I think this is going on at work, and I don't think this is fair. So I'm not, and maybe you can speak to it better than I can, I'm not so sure you have an abundance of people running to you, so to speak, just because they're trying to get a payday.
You're absolutely correct. When you hear people talk about these cases, the people who have brought them, who have stuck with them for, many years, they say that they had no choice, that what was going on was so bad that they had to do something about it. And that's what brings people to us. And that's what makes it a real honor to represent these people.
The False Claims Act, and I know this is probably where things get a little interesting because of federal government and state government always tends to be different, or sometimes one supersedes the other, or they don't necessarily 100% coincide. Does it only cover the federal government, or is there a state version? And maybe specifically in Minnesota, is there a Minnesota version of this? Can you talk about differences and maybe some of the parts that are the same, or maybe it is only one?
No, many states do have False Claims Act, and more states are getting False Claims Act because they are realizing that this is a potent way to
deter wrongdoing.
Sure, to deter wrongdoing and to return that money to their own coffers. Right now, 29 states plus the District of Columbia have False Claims Act, and Minnesota is one of those states. Our statute was just passed a couple of years ago. Also, the cities of Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia have them. Some of the states' qui tam laws only relate to Medicare fraud. And you asked about federal-state cooperation. Very often with these cases, for example, the case I was involved in that was a pharmaceutical case, it was a cooperative state-federal case, and the return on that case, some of the money went back to the states, and some of the money went to the federal government. Medicare fraud, Medicaid fraud is the monies that fund that are combined state and federal. So sometimes you're involved with both. It can make cases kind of complicated. In the federal case the pharmaceutical case I was involved in, we not only had to serve the federal government, but we served all the states involved as well. And so it gets complex.
I think you already kind of answered this, but just to be safe, I'll ask it again. Who can bring a claim under the False Claims Act? Is this basically anybody who witnesses wrongdoing? I think you kind of touched on that a little bit earlier.
Right. It's not just employees. It often is employees, but it can be competitors, it can be consultants, it can be service providers, and it can be patients themselves. There was a very interesting case recently settled, a gentleman named Richard West who has muscular dystrophy and is in a wheelchair. He all of a sudden began to notice that he would be getting explanation of benefit forms for services allegedly provided to him that he never got.
That he never got. Never asked for, maybe?
No, he asked for them. He needed those services.
But he never got them.
But people wouldn't show up. He started keeping track. People wouldn't show up. He needed help on his daily activities. And people wouldn't show up, and he started keeping track of it. And then he started reporting to the agencies involved, and they weren't doing anything about it. Finally, he learned about whistleblower qui tam acts, and he brought a whistleblower complaint, a qui tam complaint, against this agency. Part of what stimulated was his insurance company told him he had used up all his money, and he couldn't get any more services, but a lot of those billed hours he never got. And so it really was a horrendous situation. And he brought a qui tam case, and it just settled this year. Now, one of the things you need to know is that he brought it several years ago, so it was a several-year project. But he did bring a case. It was resolved, and as a relator, he achieved about a $15 million reward.
Well, and you did touch on that a little bit earlier, too. You said, look, I mean, sometimes you don't know where these are going to go. This could be months, this could be years. So I think that's an important part to note here as well.
Right. These cases are not for the faint of heart because they can take a long time. And they start off under seal, so you can't talk about them. So some of the whistleblowers will talk about how hard it is to sort of be in that in-between stage.
You're listening to the Legal Journal on Business 1570. Happy Saturday morning to you. You can hear us each and every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. I'm Ross Brindle, joined in studio this morning by Susan Kohler. She is with Halunen and Associates. We're talking about qui tam lawsuits today, and more specifically, things like the False Claims Act. You can learn more about her and the firm at halunenlaw.com. That's HALUNEN law.com. You mentioned the relators. What do they get out of the lawsuit? Let's backtrack a little bit and just kind of jump further into that.
The relators get a reward, which is a percentage of what the government got. I want to point out one thing to your listeners. Sometimes people step forward who were actively involved in the fraud.
Okay.
And that can be a tricky situation. Perhaps somebody was actively involved in the fraud, got fired, was unhappy, and thinks they can bring a qui tam case against their former employer. Now, they can, but they might expose themselves to even criminal ramifications of that. So people do need to be a little careful, and a good lawyer will recommend that they consult with a criminal attorney before they bring that lawsuit, I can assure you.
And that might also be a case maybe of somebody, and maybe you can talk to this specifically. Have you ever worked in a case where somebody brings one of these forward and so to speak, other people inside the business maybe start to roll on higher up so they can, I don't want to say cut themselves a deal, but I imagine that might happen every now and then too, correct? Where people inside that business say, whoa, look, I was a part of this, but I was just taking orders from the top down.
Sure, that happens. I've not been involved in the case I was involved in did have criminal ramifications, but typically the government handles the criminal side of it. But people do need to be careful. And sometimes once the qui tam case is filed, the company eventually will become aware that they're being investigated by the government. And sometimes they will then self-report and try to mitigate their own damages. And that's smart on their part.
Susan, we've talked about the upside of maybe getting a percentage of some type of settlement. But I don't want to say downside, but is there a possibility you go through all of this, and as you've talked about, it could be a process that takes years, like the case you just mentioned with the gentleman in the wheelchair. Is it possible to go through all of this and in the end get nothing?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's possible that what you think is fraud really doesn't fall within the statute's definition of fraud. And so these cases are complex and technical, and that's why it is important to work with an experienced attorney on them. The law is quite specific. There has to be actual fraud against the government, or a person has to use a fraudulent statement to get a payment from the government. And sometimes companies are negligent. Sometimes they do bad work. Sometimes they're wasteful, but that doesn't necessarily result in an actual fraud against the government. So you can think you have a case, and a court might decide that there wasn't fraud involved at all. Another very important piece, and this is tricky, the QTAM statutes, the False Claims Act, has what we call a first-to-file rule, which means that if multiple people file against a particular company, typically it's the first person who files who gets the reward. Now, I told you that I was involved in a case with multiple relators, and sometimes it does happen that the reward is shared amongst multiple relators if they contribute something significant to the lawsuit. But it's important to try to be the first one to file. And because these lawsuits are filed under seal, you don't know when you file whether anybody else has filed one against the company. So that's why these cases are very difficult.
But they're filed under seal to pretty much protect everybody involved, though, correct? In case, kind of like you talked about, maybe there is no wrongdoing. Is that fair to say, or am I reading into that wrong?
I think you're reading into it wrong. They're filed under seal so that the government can investigate before the company knows that somebody has brought the claim against them.
Susan, we're coming up against a break, so I'm going to ask you one more question, then we'll probably hop into it more after the break. Again, you're listening to the Legal Journal on 1570, Business 1570, that is. I'm Ross Brindle, joined in studio by Susan Kohler with Halunen and Associates. What kinds of evidence do you have to have? I know you mentioned a few cases where some of the evidence was involved, but are there certain standard bearers you're looking for evidence in these cases?
Well, obviously, the more evidence, the better. And what you need is evidence of actual fraud. That said, sometimes if you suspect that fraud is going on, sometimes working with an attorney, you can figure out ways to find the evidence without your having it in hand.
Okay, gotcha. And very quickly, we talked about the False Claims Act, but can you maybe give another quick example of some type of claims that somebody brings forward, or just in generalities, what type of claims people bring? I think that helps the listeners kind of better understand what we're talking about here and helps us reset as we head to a break.
Sure. One that I wanted to point out to you was a couple who was getting drugs under a Medicare Part D plan. They did their research and picked out a plan that said they were going to pay them a certain amount for particulars, or that they would have to pay a certain amount for particular prescriptions. They bought the plan. They started getting bills and realized that the company was billing them more than what the company originally had said they were going to bill them. They brought a QTAM case, and the company was penalized for that.
You're listening to the Legal Journal on Business 1570. Again, as I mentioned, I'm Ross Brindle. You can hear us every Saturday morning at 9 o'clock right here on Business 1570 and online at 1570.com. This morning in studio, I'm joined by Susan Kohler. She is with Halunen and Associates. I want to give out the website for you to learn more about them and maybe reach out to Susan. It's HALUNENlaw.com. That's HalunenLaw.com. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back. More with Susan Kohler from Halunen and Associates in just a few moments right here on Business 1570.
Our heroes from across the upper Midwest are coming home from wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Only now, some have a new battle to fight, unemployment. Hello, I'm Rocky Lynn, co-founder of Tribute to the Troops.
I'm Sergeant Dejan Farrell.
And I'm Captain Ron Jarvie. A survey of our troops serving overseas found 25% say employment is a major concern for them as they come home.
Right now, the unemployment rate for today's veteran is 12%. That's twice the average of others living here in the heartland.
These service members learn quickly. They've experience with advanced technology and demonstrate teamwork, discipline, and leadership under difficult circumstances.
This year, Tribute to the Troops, the Armed Forces, and the Upper Midwest Emmy Chapter are asking you to hire our today's veterans. Employers, you've seen what these veterans have done for their country. Think what they can do for your business.
To hire today's veteran, visit positivelyminnesota.com/veterans.
Heroes come from small towns.
Recently, the U.S. Navy delivered tons of food to hungry people halfway around the world.
But you could help someone in your own community simply by donating a can of soup.
Last week, a Navy doctor saved the life of a total stranger.
Just like you could. by giving a pint of blood.
Right now, a Navy captain is providing guidance to 5,000 young men and women at sea.
While there's at least one young person in your neighborhood who could use your guidance.
Next month, a team of Navy Seabees will change a child's life by building a school in an impoverished area.
You could do the same, simply by volunteering once a week to read at a school right down the street.
The men and women of America's Navy do some amazing things to make the world a better place. So can you. Whether it's by donating food or simply giving time, right in your own backyard. Brought to you by America's Navy.
Business 1570, the Legal Journal on Business 1570. I'm Ross Brindle. You know, I'm a big Law and Order fan, so I feel like I'm Sam Waterston every time I hear that music. So if I yell badgering the witness or something to you, Susan, that's just where that comes from. It's, you know, got nothing to do with anything that you had to say. Susan Kohler with Halunen and Associates joins us this morning on Business 1570 in the Legal Journal. Again, the website, halunenlaw.com. I'll give out the phone number if you have a question or comment, 651-289-4477. We also have the text line as well, 651-243-0391. That's 651-243-0391. Hopefully everybody's having a wonderful, little bit cooler of a Saturday morning. Susan, we left off talking about evidence. Let's kind of backtrack once again and just kind of reset on that and some of the evidence that you might need to have, maybe standard bearers of things that you need to know, need to see, need to have to be able to bring a qui tam lawsuit.
The most important thing is that you really have to have personal knowledge of something bad going on. It doesn't have to be detailed, but you have to know that something bad is happening, and we have to be able to show that what's bad involves some sort of fraud against the government. Like I said, sometimes it's competitors who bring qui tam cases because they know that other companies are doing bad things. And they know enough about their industry to know what that company would have to be doing in order to achieve the fraudulent result that they're getting. Sometimes employees within a company know that something bad is happening and they know that it's fraudulent. And one really important thing that I want your listeners to know is that you should not take documents from your company that you wouldn't normally have access to. That can lead to very bad results. You should talk to an attorney if you think something bad is happening, because very often in the course of that talk, you can figure out ways to document or to at least make a list of relevant evidence that would exist at the company. Eventually, in a good qui tam suit, the government becomes a part of it, and the government has investigatory powers. And if you can say, well, I know that there's a Z drive at the firm that has this information in it, you can tell the government, and they can go after it. But it is very careful. It's important for people to know that typically it's not a good idea to take anything from the company that you wouldn't normally have access to as an employee.
You don't want to create any wrongdoing yourself in the process of trying to do something good.
That's correct.
Susan, let's say, you know, I'm an employer at, you know, I don't know, John's something or another. Well, not the best fake business name, but let's just go with that. You know, John's random business. We'll go with that. I see something. I want to talk to you. Where do I start? Walk me through the process of how this works.
Well, the first thing you want to do is find a lawyer who has experience in these kinds of cases. As I've mentioned, they're complex and they can take a long time, and it helps if you start with somebody who has done them before.
And on these specific things, that is you and your firm, correct?
Yes, we do that. And there's also a national organization called Taxpayers Against Fraud, TAF, and they have a directory of attorneys who do this kind of work. I suggest that you look for somebody who's a member of that organization because we meet on a regular basis. We have listserv. We share information.
Okay.
We help each other, and that's how good law gets made, and that's how attorneys do really good work.
I find this information very, very interesting, especially some of our listeners are small business owners. They're business owners of all sizes, and I know you might not specifically be talking to them, but in a way you kind of are. You're basically saying, look, I mean, if you're doing something wrong, there is a statute out there. There are ways that you can be penalized for it, and I think that is very important to note to try and deter some of these things from happening. Not that any of our listeners would, but I think what I'm getting at is there is a way out there that if something is going on wrong, one, the business can be penalized, and two, if you're an employee, there is a way that you can basically report something bad that your employer's doing. You don't have to basically sit idly by and just let bad things happen.
That's right. Part of the whole point of the False Claims Act is to act as a deterrent to companies. And I think we see that. I think a lot has happened, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry over the last 3 or 4 years. There have been massive cases involving off-label marketing, which is another illegal type of activity that pharmaceutical companies engage in. And I think their own professional rules and their practices have changed as a result of knowing that people can come after them.
This is a nice follow-up, I think, to you just kind of, loosely walked us through the process of what you would do. And I know that it's kind of the footnote version, obviously. But paying for a lawyer in a situation like this, how does that get done? Is that something where does the government provide a lawyer? Do you go to somebody? Are you footing some of the bill on that, so to speak? How does that work if you are the employee maybe trying to file a suit against your employer?
If someone is aware of fraud against the government on the part of their employer or through some other means, they should talk to an attorney. And most attorneys who do this work do it on what we call a contingency basis.
Okay.
Which means that the whistleblower doesn't pay anything up front, but that the contingency lawyer takes a percentage of the reward.
Okay.
And so a whistleblower really should not be paying hourly fees to an attorney to do this kind of work. If they are, they're probably not spending their money wisely.
So make sure you're doing your homework on the type of attorney that you're getting in a case like this.
That's correct.
Can you keep your identity secret if you file a key tam action or a key tam suit? I'm guessing you probably can, because like you've talked about, that this is kind of filed under seal. So is that possible, or again, is that something I might be looking into wrong?
Actually, I think it is a much better proposition to presume that eventually your identity will become known.
Sure.
Because sometimes they can try to protect the relator for a while. The cases are filed under seal initially. But frankly, once a company knows they're being investigated, and once they know the nature of investigation, they often can figure out who
it was.
Right, or if they've fired somebody who's made reports, they can presume that it was that person. So I think it's very difficult to keep your identity secret. Now, you can certainly talk with your attorney about it. The person that I represented in the Abbott case recently prefers not to have his or her name known, and we have really kept it under the radar. So you can try to minimize potential damage, but it can happen.
So if you are an employee, I imagine you're protected from retaliation, correct?
The law protects you from retaliation and provides legal remedies for you, but that does not mean that retaliation won't happen.
Okay, right. Yeah, it can't stop retaliation from happening, but there is protection if it does.
Yes, you can bring a lawsuit, but often that retaliation lawsuit is after the fact as well. And so people should not, I've said it a couple times, and I'm going to say it again. Being a whistleblower takes a lot of courage.
Sure.
Because while we can say that the laws will protect you, and in many cases, some companies do the right things. Many companies do. And they will act on your reports. But it doesn't always happen that way. And then it can take a while before you get any remedy from your retaliation claim. So again, people have to have a lot of courage and be willing to live for a good period of time without knowing whether or not their losses are going to be covered.
Susan Kohler with Halunen and Associates joins us this morning on the Legal Journal on Business 1570. The website, halunenlaw.com. That's HALUNEN law.com. Susan, can you base a claim on information you maybe learned through the internet, the media, maybe something you saw on TV? Is that something you can base a claim on for these?
Typically, no.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, one of the potential ways that you can start a qui tam lawsuit and not be successful is if the information is already known in the public arena. However, again, if you know something about the interior workings of some agency or company that are fraudulent, and even if there's some information about that out in the public arena, you should talk to an attorney, Because if you have inside knowledge, sometimes you can bring a qui tam lawsuit even though there is some public information out there about it.
Okay, let's say that you no longer work with a business, or maybe what you saw happened, I don't know, a year ago, 2 years ago. You haven't really seen anything since, but you still think there might have been wrongdoing and it still hasn't sat well with you. Is there, so to speak, a statute of limitations on when you can go forward with information like this? Can you do it when you're no longer employed? Is there X amount of years where you basically have to come forward and maybe file this?
There is a statute of limitations. It's 6 years, so you have quite a bit of time to act on it.
You are covered for a fair amount of time.
If the government becomes involved, there are ways in which the statute can go back even 10 years.
Are there cases that you've worked with or examples of cases where that has happened, where maybe somebody worked for a place 3-4 years ago and then they came forward? Are there specific examples maybe like that?
Sure, because very often if the person has been a whistleblower, they've been fired. And so then they sit with that for a bit. Sometimes they try to see if they can get some recourse right away, but sometimes it takes a while. Sometimes people aren't aware that not only were they fired illegally, but they also have knowledge that could lead to a qui tam lawsuit.
This might be the most important part we talk about all day. We came back to this segment and kind of walked through the process, but I'd kind of like to do that again briefly if you don't mind. So somebody calls you up, and they go to the website, halunenlaw.com, HALUNEN law.com. They reach out to you. How does that process start? What's basically your first question back to them? What are you asking them in response to when they reach out to you?
Well, I'm glad we're coming back to this because I think we haven't really covered the whole process. So it starts with an intake interview where I would ask a lot of questions. What do you know? What happened? What is the extent of the fraud? How high up in the company does it go? How do you know about it? What do you think the loss to the government is? There are many, many questions that we ask in an intake setting. If we think it's something worth pursuing, we will have the person sign a retainer agreement with us and start doing additional investigation. If the person has documents that normally are in their possession, we can look at those, and we will look at those. Often once we have a sense that something is happening, we can also access other public documents. For example, if you have a case involving whether a company is truly a disadvantaged minority business or not, there's a lot of public databases about contracts and who's got the contracts and how much they're for. So we can do investigation that way. If we think it's a potential suit, sometimes we will actually consult with the government about it with our client before we even file the qui tam lawsuit to see what their interest is and to determine whether or not we might get any sense as to whether other people have been pursuing this particular employer. We don't always get information about that, but sometimes, in some instances, you're obligated to talk to the government before you file your lawsuit. Even. So after we do that, then we put together what we call a complaint, which is the listing of the bad activities that happened. That complaint gets filed under seal, and it gets filed with the court. But it gets filed with the government through the Attorney General's office, but it does not get served on the defendant. That's what makes this kind of lawsuit really, really different. It doesn't get served on the defendant because the government gets some time to investigate it.
And build a case, so to speak.
At the same time that you file the complaint, you also file with the government, with the Attorney General's office, what we call a disclosure statement or a statement of material facts. And that is basically an explanation of the case and an explanation of all the evidence that you have. These cases are unusual in that you almost have to put together your entire case at the very beginning and put together everything you can find relating to it and present it to the government. In terms of evidence, the government wants you to provide them not only with the evidence that you have, which is whatever documents you might have in your possession, but also any ideas as to how they might investigate. For example, you might know a person who's no longer works there who might have knowledge. It's not the qui tam relator shouldn't necessarily go out and interview people. That's up to the government to do. But you can give the government a list of names. You can give the government a list of documents. You may be aware of documents that are pertinent and persuasive and, smoking guns, but if you don't normally have those in your possession, you're much smarter to have made a list of those documents, and then we tell the government about those.
Is the government made aware of alleged wrongdoing almost right away, or does it take you do you do a little bit of work on your own before you go to the government? How quick is the government made aware?
Well, it's as quickly as you can put your claim together and put together your complaint and put together your disclosure statement. And it's a very fine line that you walk because you want to be the first to file, but yet you want to have a good case to file.
Sure.
The government only actively pursues 1 out of 5 qui tam cases that are filed.
You're taking my next question from me. I was just going to ask you, how many of these cases do the government take? And if you can answer it, what do you do if the government chooses not to? Is that the end of the case?
It's not the end of the case necessarily. Once you file the lawsuit and give your disclosure statement to the government, they have certain periods of time in which they can investigate, and then they decide whether or not they're going to intervene or not. And before I actually talk about what happens if they decide not to intervene, sometimes that can take a while. It can take a year or two.
Okay.
But if the government decides to intervene, then you move forward with the government, and the government does most of the work. If the government decides not to intervene, then the individual has to make a decision, and their attorney, whether or not they'll proceed with the case. They can litigate it individually on their own, and some huge awards have resulted from those things, but they are very difficult, and whether or not the attorney is willing to do it on a contingency basis will depend. That's a decision you make at that point.
At that point, okay.
Often, if the government decides not to intervene, they'll give you information about why. If they've determined that there was no fraud, then obviously there might not be a good reason to continue on. But the government sometimes will, there could be a variety of reasons why they choose not to intervene, including just resources. And so they might think you have a perfectly good case. It's just not one that they're going to pursue at the time.
Sure.
And so if you get that kind of information, then the attorney and the relator may decide to proceed with.
To continue forward.
Yes.
HalunenLaw.com is the website, HALUNEN law.com. I'm joined in studio by Susan Kohler this morning. She is with Halunen and Associates. Susan, I think I might have hopped in there a little bit early. Did you have something else you wanted to add on that topic?
No, I think we've pretty much covered. I just want to be sure people are clear on the process. You talk to an attorney, you put together the facts, you determine whether you actually have a legitimate claim that involves fraud.
And don't take any documents.
Don't steal documents from the company.
Don't take anything you wouldn't have access to.
Yeah, that said, it's kind of interesting. In the medical field, the HIPAA laws actually allow you sometimes to disclose to an attorney information if it will lead to uncovering fraud. So you don't steal documents, but there is information that you may have that can be used.
Okay.
But again, it should be done very carefully and with an attorney's advice.
Susan, here's a very interesting and intriguing part to this whole thing for me, and I wanted to save it towards the end because I didn't just want to hit you with this question right away, and then I don't know what we would talk about for the next 40 minutes because this kind of all builds up to that. Well, what do you tell the employee after you talk to them, they sit down with you, maybe you're working on putting together that case, maybe the government's been made aware, but at the very beginning, what do you tell that employee? I mean, how do you direct them to go back to work? Because as you mentioned, most of them do because they're going to have to continue to work, correct? What do you tell them at the beginning of the process for what they're getting into? Because as you said, they have to have a lot of courage because they probably know it's not going to be an easy process. But I also imagine once they maybe sit down and talk with you, it might be a little tough for them to get really excited to go back to work the next day.
Well, if they still are employed at the company against which they plan to bring a qui tam lawsuit, going back to work can be very important because obviously you can get additional information.
Sure, and I should stop myself and backtrack and say you deal with these lawsuits all the time of people who are no longer employed at the company.
Correct.
But if you are still employed,
you do have to go back to work, and you have to continue to do the best you can to try to prevent this wrongdoing from happening. If it's something that really has serious ramifications for, let's say, health and well-being of the military or of patients, it's quite likely I would get the government involved pretty quickly so that we could figure out what kind of investigation we want to do while the person is still employed.
You mentioned this towards the beginning of the show, but I want to go back to this as well. Can there be more than one private plaintiff in a particular qui tam lawsuit? I know you said oftentimes if they give out a reward, it tends to be to the first person who brings this forward, but I know that's not entirely always the case. Is that correct?
That is correct, and sometimes people will come in groups or a pair. And actually, that can be very helpful. Number one, it provides a built-in support group for the relators. Number two, if you have sometimes more than one relator, you get a much broader set of information that you can offer to the government and a broader set of witnesses. So I forgot to mention that after you file your lawsuit, your QTAM lawsuit under seal, and while the government is investigating, very often the government will interview your client and try to get all the information. And they'll bring their investigators. If it involves state and federal, they'll bring their state and federal investigators and talk to your client. So that's an important piece of it.
Susan Kohler with Halunen and Associates joins us this morning on the Legal Journal on Business 1570. Learn more at halunenlaw.com. That's HALUNEN law.com. Susan, if you don't mind, we talked about the beginning of the show, but for listeners who are just joining into the program, why don't you talk a little bit about your background and how you got involved in QTAM lawsuits, just so our listeners are aware of that, because I think that's very vital information.
Sure. I represent plaintiffs in employment situations and in consumer situations, and I importantly and primarily represent employees who are whistleblowers, meaning that they've reported some sort of wrongdoing against their companies. QTAM lawsuits are a special kind of whistleblower case where a person may not have been injured themselves, but they've been in a position to observe a company commit serious fraud against the government. And so the QTAM whistleblower is a person who is in that situation. Sometimes that person has also been victimized by being fired or retaliated against when they've tried to correct the wrong within the company. But that's how I got into the work, through my work with employees. And it's a work that is very, very satisfying because you're helping somebody who has a lot of integrity act on it and achieve some real systemic change. And you're also hopefully repaying money to the public fisc that's been stolen by somebody else.
Well, and that brings me back to something we talked about earlier, but I wanted to make sure that we did mention this again. We talked about it. It doesn't really matter, what party affiliation you have, so to speak. This is something that affects everybody. If the government is being cheated, Susan, you're losing, myself is losing, everybody who's listening is losing if the government's being cheated, because we're paying for that in the end, aren't we?
That's correct. And some of the more egregious cases, not only is the government and taxpayers losing, but individuals are being harmed. I've got a stack of cases here involving the many, many different ways in which people try to cheat the government, and it's actually kind of depressing. But the good news is that sometimes people do take action. And so,
can you list a few of those ways if you don't mind?
It might make sense to do that. School lunch programs. The contract with the government says if you're getting a deal from a provider, you're supposed to pass on that savings to the government. People don't do that. There was a case recently settled involving flares used in combat that didn't survive a test. They're supposed to be able to be dropped from a 10-foot height and not explode, and they were exploding. And so defective
and they were still being used.
Still being used by the military. Pension plans, where a lot of the housing problems that we've been having, selling bad mortgages to government pension plans. That's another type of QTAM case. As plaintiffs, lawyers, we've been really struggling with the whole housing situation and, how to help people who have been harmed by that situation. There have recently been a couple of very good QTAM cases where people have been actually able to go in or to tackle the inside workings that have caused all the mortgage or some of the mortgage problems and go after the banks that have been, putting together bad groups of loans and selling them to people who've lost a lot of money. So that's another recent area. School lunch program.
So really, Susan, this is a vast array. It's not like we're looking at one type of business and saying this is where these happen. These QTAM lawsuits really can happen at any business, correct? With
any business.
With any type of work.
The secret, or not the secret, the link is that it has to involve some sort of business with the government.
Okay.
And it doesn't even have to be direct. If I'm a subcontractor and I'm working with somebody who works for somebody who gives things to the government, if the fraud is happening down at the third or fourth level down, that still can impact the government and still can result in a QTAM case. Healthcare is a big area. I wanted to mention home health care services. People don't give what they say they're giving.
Sure, and you mentioned one of those at the beginning.
A recent one that people might be interested in hospice care, people getting put in hospice care when they're not eligible for it. Eligibility is a big area of key TAM cases. Education, student loans, people posing as minority businesses and getting contracts that are set aside for minority businesses when they're not really minority businesses, or they're just pass-throughs. There's just so many different ways that people can cheat the government.
Susan, we have just a few moments left in the show, a little less than 2 minutes. So very, very quickly, in closing, and I think you kind of touched on it, you yourself want to make sure that people know it's basically has to involve the government. But beyond that, for people listening today, what do you want them to know about these key TAM lawsuits? What is so important about them to you that you want everybody to know about?
Well, I think it is a way for people who have integrity to act on their principles. And if they feel powerless within a situation where they see bad things happening and it involves fraud against the government, they can consult with an attorney. And, maybe they've already reported to a government agency that hasn't done anything, or they've reported to their employer and nothing's happened, and they're really bothered by it. They should talk to a key TAM attorney, a person who's experienced in bringing claims under the False Claims Act, and see if that's an arena where they can act on their integrity. And sometimes very amazing things can happen.
Susan, it's been very enjoyable having you in here this morning. A lot of great knowledge and a lot of great information. I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday, okay?
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to work with people who bring these cases, so I'm always happy to talk about it.
That is Susan Kohler. She is with Halunen and Associates. You can learn more at halunenlaw.com. I'll spell that out. HALUNEN law.com. That's halunenlaw.com. You can reach out to Susan via that website and all the fine folks at Halunen and Associates, again at halunenlaw.com. That'll do it for the Legal Journal today on Business 1570. Again, my thanks to Susan for helping us out this morning. We are back next Saturday at 9 o'clock right here on Business 1570 for more of the Legal Journal.